Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Blade Arcus from Shining. Battle Arena is the PC version, but EX is the version that's available on PS3 and PS4. Obviously what you're seeing here is Battle Arena on the PC. This is a 2D fighting game developed by Studio Seizen and published by Sega originally, although for PC, Studio Seizen actually self-published it. And it was originally released in 2014 for arcades, later saw a release on PS4 and PS3 in 2015, and now it's been released as a PC game as well. And like the previous anime-styled fighting game that I reviewed, which was Koihime Enbu, this one pretty much flew under the radar. I mean, I certainly didn't know it existed until I was looking around on a PR site and found it on there. And after taking a look at it, I reached out to the PR people to see if I could get a review copy of it, and they did provide one, so full disclaimer there. But I should also disclose to you that I know absolutely nothing about the Shining series other than it's a series of JRPGs. I do have Shining Force 1 and 2, and I do have Shining in the Darkness, but that's it. I know absolutely nothing at all about the games that it's drawing characters from, which are Shining Blade and Shining Hearts, both of which I believe were only released in Japan, so I wouldn't really know much about them anyway. So I was basically going into it with a similar mindset to the mindset I was going into Koihime Enbu with, that it's an anime fighting game and I was judging it more as a fighting game than anything else. And of course the question becomes, on those grounds, how is this thing? Well, as far as presentation goes, they have this sort of rotoscope 3D look for the characters, and the environments themselves seem to be 3D modeled as well, meaning that while it is anime style and it is technically a 2D fighter, all of the visuals are actually 3D modeled and animated, and generally they're pretty well done. It's just problematic because the game renders in 720p, so if you scale it up to 1080p when you go full screen, it looks kind of blurry. The animations themselves are generally fairly smooth and fluid, although there are a few oddities here and there, and there are a lot of really bright flashing effects going on because of course this is an anime fighter and we gotta have tons of those, right? That of course does mean that it gets in your way a lot when you're actually doing the fighting, and sometimes it becomes a bit difficult to judge the distance that an attack is actually going to hit at just because of that. Well, at least until you've picked up on the exact distancing you need in order to be able to get through those particular maneuvers. Then of course there's all the numbers that constantly pop up on the screen, and I'm not entirely sure what they're supposed to mean. I think they're kinda sorta supposed to be damage numbers, but it's hard to tell for sure there. And they're actually kind of annoying because they pop up all the time. And it becomes particularly problematic because there's no way to disable them as far as I've found, so you're just gonna have to live with them. You're also gonna have to live with the fact that the story mode in this game is pretty bare bones when it comes to the actual cutscenes and such like that. You get no actual cinematics, instead you get a series of just dialogues with character CGs in the background, and that's really it. Almost no animation whatsoever on them, and it makes it feel like the story mode is actually just pretty much an afterthought entirely. At least the artwork itself is good, although it would be better if it wasn't rendered at 720p. Then of course there's the sound design, where the music is catchy but rather forgettable in the long run. It's good enough in the moment, it's upbeat, it will get you through the fight without any problems, and in the moment it's pretty nice, but it's not something you're probably gonna sit back and listen to after the fact. And that's mostly because it sounds pretty generic as far as JRPG-styled fighting game music goes. Then of course there's the sound effects themselves, which are pretty typical for an anime fighter. There's not really much to talk about there. If you know what the sound effects are like, then they're gonna be right at home here. And finally, the voice acting. Now, the actual in-game voice acting is all in Japanese, and as far as I can tell, they do a pretty good job with it. But then there's the announcer voice, and I can't help but crack up every single time he says something, because it's a Japanese man trying to speak English. Now, when it comes to Japanese people trying to speak English, there are really three boats they're going to fall into. One, they're almost indistinguishable from Americans, probably because they spent a lot of time in the US and just learned the language that way. Two, they're heavily accented but understandable, and they still get all the English correct. And three, there's this.
Blade Arcus! Select your character. Round 1, fight!
Needless to say, the announcer is fairly amusing. But of course what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this revolves around 7 orbs that when collected will grant the bearer of them a wish. which is clearly the most original storyline in the history of fighting games. Oh, who am I kidding? This is one of the most generic anime storylines you can possibly have. I mean, hell, even the entity that grants the wishes is called a dragon in the game, so obviously they've taken more than a few cues from other media, and what they actually have that's somewhat original is pretty much just table scraps. In the story mode, each character gets a sort of intro cutscene. It's like I mentioned before, it's just some text with some CG art in the background. And then during the actual story mode, occasionally you'll get another cutscene that's the exact same thing, but none of them really tell you all that much about the characters, meaning that the only way you're really going to be able to understand the various characters is if you've played Shining Hearts and Shining Blade, which is pretty much impossible if you're in the US unless you manage to go to Japan and pick them up. Or imported them, but the only people who are going to do that are pretty much just die-hard fans of the Shining series anyway. For the rest of us, the only real characterizations we get are from the rather wimpy dialogue and the really just visual design themselves. And speaking of the visual design for these characters, it was what I'd describe as fairly generic anime styling, which is not to say it's bad, it's just that you've seen it all pretty much everywhere before. I mean, just look at it and look at various anime that you might have seen, and it's pretty easy to see where I'm coming from on that. And certain characters feel like they were just thrown in there for the sake of actually having them, like the cat girl and the fox girl. Although they could be extremely important characters in the Shining series. I legitimately don't know that because I haven't played those games. I can tell you that I've found both the cat girl and the fox girl rather annoying, mostly because the cat girl's just annoying in her dialogue, and the fox girl has a bunch of moves that send her careening all over the damn arena. And that does bring up the point that every character does have their own nuances to them. They all have their own special moves and things that they're good at and not good at, and that means that there is some degree of specialization when it comes to actually playing as the various characters, which is actually a good thing. Despite my not liking playing certain characters, it's because they are the character types that I don't like playing. For example, Rosalinda is not really a character I like playing. I don't like playing slow, heavy hitters. I generally prefer to play characters that are more middle of the road, which means that characters like, say, Rick and Pyron and Sonya are really more up my alley. Luckily, the cast is diverse enough to allow you to pick a style and stick with it if that's your thing, but ultimately it does also have the problem of the game being very, very simplistic. None of the characters really have a lot of variation in their special moves. In fact, they don't really have all that many special moves to begin with. They all have a super move of some description. Some of them have 2 super moves. And everybody can call in support characters, so you get a 2-person tag team going on. And you can press a button to send in that character to do things like, for example, get you out of a tight spot, which uses up a bunch of your support meter, or you can send them in there to add to your combo, which is always nice. But other than that, they don't really play that much of a role outside of when you get to the end of a round, where you can actually switch between your 2 characters as your main. So if, for example, you're having a hard time against one particular opponent, then you can switch over to the other character and play the next round as that character instead of the person you were playing as before, and maybe they're better suited to dealing with that particular enemy. This means that it behooves you to, at the very least, learn how to play as 2 different characters. Now, preferably you would learn how to play as all of them, and maybe there's 1 or 2 that you're particularly good at. But the way this game is set up, it's pretty easy to pick up and play. There's really not a lot of complex controls here. It's not a particularly technical fighter. It's really more of a back-to-basics style of fighting game. And there really aren't enough characters to where learning all of them becomes a particularly big problem. Now, some of them may not be to your particular playstyle, obviously, but that's to be expected. It's a fighting game. They need to have a cast diverse enough to suit that need. Still, it is a bit hard to shake the idea that the characters feel a bit generic in their implementation, and when you actually get into the available game modes, that becomes especially problematic. You see, there are only 4 game modes. One of them is the basic practice mode, so you can just try out different moves and combos and such like that against a pretty much inanimate opponent. There is, of course, your basic versus mode, where you can either play against the AI or against another player. Then there's story mode, where it's basically just your simple arcade mode, but with these various cutscenes in them, and it's a pretty bare-bones mode because it only goes up to 8 matches. And finally, you can go online for ranked or casual play. Here's the problem. This is what happens when you try to play online. As you can see, the player base for this is pretty minimal if it even exists at all, and that means that you're probably never going to actually be able to find an online game unless you organize it yourself. Now, I have seen reports that the netcode itself is pretty typical of a 2D fighting game, which is to say that it's really not very good, but I actually cannot confirm that myself because I've never been able to get into an online match. That just leaves story mode and versus mode. Obviously with versus mode you can at least play against the AI, so that's nice, but story mode is really the meat of the game for this, and there's really not much to it. As I mentioned before, it basically takes you through an arcade ladder of 8 matches, and at the very end of it you fight the final boss, which is just a mirror match, and that's it. You're playing against yourself, only an evil version of you. It's frankly an incredibly lazy way of handling the final boss of the game, and really, the game in general is just not that difficult. If you put it on very easy, the only thing the AI will do is move around. If you put it on easy, it will very, very rarely swing at you. If you put it on normal, it's basically other fighting games super easy mode. If you put it on hard, it's basically other fighting games normal difficulty. And if you put it on very hard, then that's pretty much other fighting games hard mode. And there's really not much reason for the first 3 difficulty modes in this thing to exist. I mean, seriously, if you don't believe me, this is the difference between very hard and easy. Now, the first thing you're going to see is easy mode, where I just sped up the footage because you'll see that the AI doesn't do anything except move around, and on very hard, you'll see that it's pretty much just a normal hard mode for a fighting game. Mostly I just ended up playing on the basic hard mode, and that was occasionally a challenge, but really not all that often, unless, of course, I was playing a character I just wasn't very good with. And that's saying something considering, frankly, I suck at fighting games. I'm really not good at them at all, and yet I was doing just fine in this. That tells me that this is an extremely casual fighting game that's really meant to appeal only to Shining series fans rather than anyone else, and they're not the kind of people who would be playing fighting games very much to begin with. So I guess it stands to reason that the game is going to be much lower on the difficulty and complexity side of things, but even then, it means that unless you're playing on at the very least hard mode, the game is kinda boring. If you play on hard or very hard, then you find that the game itself is fairly decent as a fighting game. It's nothing particularly special, but it's a solid enough fighting game that if you're into the genre, you should be able to get something out of. Or if you're a fan of the Shining series, then you should be able to get something out of it because it's based on that. But it's really hard to recommend this to a more general audience, particularly at the main asking price that they've got going for this thing, which is $30. There are other fighting games out there with more content, with more difficulty, that are better fighting games, that are more technical fighting games, and they're either priced competitively with this, or they're priced lower than this. I mean, to give you a prime example, would you rather play this or BlazBlue Chrono Phantasma Extend, for example, because they're the same asking price? Or maybe you'd rather play Guilty Gear Exard's Sign, which is also $30. And again, they're just frankly better fighting games than this. It's not to say that this game is bad, it's certainly not bad. It's just what I would describe as overwhelmingly average. It is made for a very specific audience, and outside of that audience, it's really not going to have much appeal at all. And that's ultimately what's going to make or break this thing for you. If you're a fan of the Shining series, I can probably recommend it to you because you might be able to get more out of it than I did, or that a general fighting game player would. But if you're a more general fighting game player, then frankly, you've got better options available to you, and the only reason I could recommend it is if it were on sale for a really good price. Again, not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination, but it's just not a particularly good value proposition, especially not at the price they're asking for it right now. Ultimately, I give it a 3 out of 5. Thanks for watching.